Tough act to follow, Salyards. I don't have any fancy animations or anything. Good morning. For those of you who don't know, I'm Robin Jones. I'm a criminal justice management consultant at IFSD within the National Institute of Justice. As Ken referenced earlier in his presentation, I'm the executive secretariat for the Standards Interagency Working Group. And so one thing that came to mind as I heard Ken and Mark giving their introductory remarks was, I think there was an emphasis that while this effort was established in an outcropping of the actual NAS report, there has been some commentary that we need to view that as a catalyst to identify and establish this framework. So I don't think that, personally, that we're limited by the things that come up in the report, but rather it is a jumping off point for us. That having been said, I did point out some specific references within the report throughout the recommendations, and there are numerous recommendations that actually specifically reference standards. And some of the questions that arise, how do we define what these terms mean? Because clearly they are variable depending on your perspective, your experience. So, in what areas are we looking at? Are we talking about technical procedures? Are we talking about report writing? So those are just some of the questions that come up when we look at some of the recommendations. Establishing the standards and the mandatory accreditation issues. So, who develops the standards? What is the process by which the standards are developed? And what's the enforcement mechanism? Is it an accreditation? Is it linked to accreditation somehow? So some of those are some additional questions to consider. The standardized terminology is a really big issue. Clearly, match, consistent with, identical. Some of the proposed report writing language is currently supported through your scientific working groups. But those are sort of, they're different in how they have gone into the depths of defining what those terms might mean for their particular disciplines that they represent. And again, what is the enforcement mechanism for people implementing those terminologies in what they're doing on a daily basis? And again, another issue that the NAS report cites is this mandatory issue, and most disciplines still lacking best practices. And I think that most of us might actually take issue with that. But again, coming back to those specific references. So, establishing protocols for examinations, methods, and practices. And it's interesting how they start to interchangeably use the term standards and best practices in collaboration with accreditation and certification training. So they're starting to kind of bring these main issues together. But again, what is the development process? And frankly, what is the impact for implementation? If we are, as a community, recognizing that we might have some gaps, how do we address those issues on the ground level? So where do we go from here? Part of, obviously, the work that we're doing is, trying to define what will constitute a robust standard. Again, what is the development process? Who is contributing? Clearly, the constituents, the practitioners. But what are the minimum criteria? And should this be uniform across all standards that are implemented? And is there a review process? We all recognize that you don't want to standardize yourself into a box. So, do you make the standard at a minimum level, or do you build a robust standard and then have a really great review process so that it can be amended and updated as needed and as identified by the community? And interestingly, what should be standardized? We have to determine, your techniques, your reports, the language, the discovery information that you might provide. Frankly, that might help you, given some of the stories that I've heard, and evidence management and these sorts of things. All considerations for where we're going. So part of the framework that you sort of try to establish for how you're going to tackle this beast, let's identify first who are these organizations that develop standards? Well, again, how do you define a standard? There's a lot of organizations, frankly, that do develop standards, and we can reference a process like the ASTM. But there are also, other organizations that develop standards or best practices or guidelines. And so we have collected information, casting the net as widely as we can, because I think that's an important process. And then doing this inventory, and that's where it gets difficult, because sometimes standards are only issued to a specific individual. And I think it's important, though, to identify, once you have this inventory, where, doing some sort of comparative analysis is important. And then analyzing the standards once you have them in place, how do they meet the needs of the practitioner and of the criminal justice community? And what are those needs, frankly? We have to take a step back and really figure out what needs are to be met. And doing the gap analysis, again, that's pretty straightforward, doing the analysis. But this one is going to be really interesting, the process which can be designed to determine which standards to use and how they should be implemented. That's really a practitioner issue, which brings us back to the notion that this is, when we say we, it's everyone in this room and all the practitioners throughout the country who are actually going to be impacted by some of these issues. And developing the cost estimates, I think, is pretty significant issue as well. Are we looking towards, the SWIGs that are currently in place? Again, ASTM, are these mechanisms working? Are there other mechanisms? Are there fields such as the medical community that we can look to in their processes to learn something and perhaps interject some new energy and a new perspective into helping us figure out the answers to these questions? And then again, what is the fiscal impact of adopting amended or new standards within the practitioner community? And access, we've found, is a pretty significant issue, again, as we're trying to inventory these issues. Are we looking at, and you as a community will have to decide, uniform and equal access of all standards that are published, perhaps through ASTM? That's a question that we can consider. And this enforcement issue, as Mark referenced earlier, when you talk about policies and how are we going to support implementation appropriately, is one that is certainly a significant, because if you're doing all this work on the front end and then there's no way to enforce it or support the implementation, then that's something that would be a significant loss. And again, I want to just take a step back. We talk about, especially within the trace community, crime labs a lot. But there are a lot of forensic service providers that do operate outside of a controlled laboratory environment that aren't subject to an accreditation program, if you will. So, just recognizing that we see, all forensic service providers, not just crime laboratory practitioners, as part of the community. So again, here's the information for the co-chairs for the standards, practices, and protocols working group. And that's the end of my show. Thank you.